Today, we're going back to one of the bleakest, bloodiest chapters in the history of House Stark. Long before Robb Stark rode south to war. Long before Eddard Stark ever stood as Warden of the North. Centuries, perhaps thousands of years, before anyone had heard the words Game of Thrones, Winterfell was ruled by kings who did not inherit peace. They carved it year after year out of ice, blood, and constant war. One of those kings left behind a name that still echoes through the crypts of Winterfell. Theon Stark, the Hungry Wolf. But who was he really? Why does a single carved statue in a dark crypt carry a nickname this frightening, centuries after the man himself turned to dust? And how much of what we think we know about him is history, and how much is legend that's grown up around a name? Here is what we actually know. And here is where the histories run out and the legend begins. Today we're going to uncover the complete story of Theon Stark, the Hungry Wolf. Chapter 1. The Hungry Wolf. Every great house in Westeros keeps its dead close. For House Stark, that means the crypts beneath Winterfell, a cold stone labyrinth running deeper into the earth with every generation that's buried there. Long rows of granite kings sitting on stone thrones, swords laid across their laps, direwolves carved at their feet. Somewhere among those rows stands a king unlike the others. According to the accounts preserved in Westeros, his statue shows him thin, almost skeletal, with long hair and a wispy, uneven beard. He wears an iron and bronze crown, and the name carved beneath him is one that later Starks would remember for a very particular reason. Theon Stark, the Hungry Wolf. We know this name from the books themselves. It's Bran Stark who first walks past this statue in a Game of Thrones, and passes it again in a Clash of Kings. And centuries later in the story, it's Theon Greyjoy, the boy raised as a ward of Winterfell, and named deliberately after this very king, who recalls the statue again in A Dance with Dragons. That's not a coincidence. House Stark named an Ironborn hostage after one of the most fearsome kings in their own family history, which tells you something about how that name was remembered. But this raises an important question. What does the Hungry Wolf actually mean? Is it a description of his body, gaunt, wasted, hollow-cheeked? Or is it a description of his reign, a north that never stopped being at war, year after year, campaign after campaign? The honest answer, according to the histories, is both. And to understand why, we have to go back much further than Theon himself, back to the north before he was ever born, and the world that made a king like him necessary. Chapter 2. The North before Theonto understand Theon Stark. We first need to travel back to the land he ruled. The North is enormous, bigger in fact, than all the other kingdoms of Westeros put together. But it's also sparse. Thin soil, brutal winters, a short growing season and vast stretches of wilderness, the Wolfswood, the haunted forest, the barren hills of the mountain clans, separating small pockets of settlement. This matters enormously for understanding a king like Theon. The North was never a place that could support the kind of dense, wealthy, heavily garrisoned kingdoms you'd find in the South. Holding it together required something else, loyalty enforced by strength, and a ruling house that could project power across hundreds of miles of nearly empty land. That ruling house was House Stark, and its seat was Winterfell. But the North it ruled was never fully unified in the way a modern viewer might imagine. Mountain clans in the high passes answered to the Starks in name more than in daily practice. The Ironborn raided the western coastline whenever they smelled weakness. Wildlings beyond the wall pressed south when the cold drove them to it. And to the east, across the narrow sea and down through the Vale, a people were arriving who would change the entire political shape of Westeros forever. The Andalos. Theon Stark's reign sits, according to the world of ice and fire, right in the middle of this collision. He was a king in the north during the coming of the Andalos, one of the most disruptive periods in the entire history of the continent. Before we go further into his story, we need to understand what kind of throne he actually inherited. Chapter 3. The Stark King's House. Stark's rule over the north wasn't just old. According to northern tradition, it stretches back to the Age of Heroes itself. to Bran the Builder, the legendary founder credited by Northern lore with raising Winterfell and the Wall alike. Whether that founding story is literal history or the kind of foundational legend every ancient house accumulates, the histories don't let us say for certain. What we can say with confidence is that by the time of Theon Stark, House Stark had already ruled the North, in one form or another, for thousands of years. Their title changed over time. The oldest Stark rulers were called Kings of Winter. Later generations used the title King in the North. Theon Stark is remembered by both, sometimes as a King of Winter, sometimes simply as a king in the North, which is itself a small clue about how ancient and how loosely dated this period of history really is. And this is something worth pausing on, because it will matter for the rest of this documentary. The crypts of Winterfell contain dozens of Stark kings: Brandon the Shipwright, Brandon the Burner,
Torrhen the King who knelt, Edric Jorah Jonos, Benjen the Sweet, Benjen the Bitter,
and many more. And even the maesters who catalogue this history admit they aren't entirely sure of the order. When Bran Stark walks through the crypts in the books, the statues he passes appear in one sequence. When he walks through again later, the sequence is different. Westeros's own historians don't treat this as strict chronology. That uncertainty isn't a flaw in the story, it's the point. The deeper into Northern history you go, the less reliable the record becomes. And Theon Stark sits deep enough in that record that we're relying on fragments, not a continuous chronicle. Chapter 4. Who was Theon Stark? Let's take a closer look at what's actually confirmed about the man himself, separated cleanly from anything that later storytelling or fandom might have added on top. Here is what we know with confidence. He was a king in the North and head of House Stark. His statue in the Winterfell crypts depicts him as thin, with long hair and a skinny beard, wearing a stone crown. He ruled during the coming of the Andalos, the great migration that reshaped Westeros. He defended the North during that invasion, allying with House Bolton to defeat an Andal warlord in a battle called the Battle of the Weeping Water. Afterward, he carried the war back across the narrow sea to Andalos itself. He later fought campaigns around the Three Sisters and the Fingers, put down a rebellion from a region called the Rills, and assisted the Night's Watch against the wildlings beyond the Wall. And during his reign, the Ironborn under King Harag Hård invaded the western coast of the North, a war that Theon eventually won. That's the entire confirmed record. No wife is named, no children are named, no birth date, no death date, no physical description beyond that one statue. We don't know how old he was when he took the crown, how long he reigned or how he died. This is where the histories leave us with more questions than answers. And it's exactly why a documentary like this one has to be careful. Everything that follows in this video is built on that short list of confirmed facts, expanded with real historical and geographical context about the world Theon lived in. Where the record is silent, we'll say so plainly, rather than filling the silence with invention. Chapter 5. Winterfell. Before we go further into Theon's wars, we need to understand the seat of power he ruled from. Winterfell sits near the center of the North, built, according to Northern legend, atop natural hot springs that keep its walls and glass gardens warm even through the worst winters. It's less a single castle than a small fortified town. Towers, a godswood with a weirwood tree at its heart, crypts sunk deep beneath the earth, and battlements built for a climate that tries to kill everyone inside them. For a king like Theon, Winterfell wasn't a symbol of luxury. It was the one secure base from which authority over an enormous, thinly settled kingdom could be projected. Every campaign we'll discuss in this documentary, against the Andals, against the Ironborn along the Wall, required Theon to leave that base and commit his limited manpower to distant, dangerous ground. That's a recurring theme in Northern kingship generally, and it becomes especially important in Theon's case, where the histories describe a reign that was, in the words later Starks used to describe it, in a constant state of war. The crypts beneath Winterfell are also where Theon's story technically survives at all. It's his statue, noted, described, and later referenced by name, that gives us almost everything we know about him. In a very real sense, this documentary exists because of a piece of stone carved by masons, whose own names are long forgotten. To understand the wars of the Hungry Wolf, we need to understand who else was sharing his kingdom. The North Theon ruled was a patchwork of loyalties. House Bolton of the Dreadfort, infamous even in this era for flaying their enemies, were bitter historical rivals of House Stark for centuries, waging on and off war before eventually swearing fealty. And it's worth noting, during Theon's reign, House Bolton isn't an enemy. According to the histories, it's an ally. Bolton forces fought alongside Theon at the Battle of the Weeping Water against the invading Andalos. That's a detail that complicates the simple, stark good. Bolton evil framing a lot of viewers bring into Northern history for at least one crucial battle. The two most famous rival houses in the North stood on the same side of the field. Beyond the Boltons, the North held the mountain clans of the High Passes, semi-independent and loosely loyal to Winterfell. It held Bear Island, home to House Mormont, sitting exposed on the western coast, directly in the path of any Ironborn fleet crossing from the Iron Islands. And it held the Wolfswood, a vast forest running along much of the western shoreline, which, and as we'll see, became a target during the Ironborn invasion of Theon's reign. This is the world Theon Stark had to hold together while also fighting off invaders from two completely different directions at once. The Andalos arriving from the east, and the Ironborn raiding from the west. Few kings in the north before or after him faced pressure on that many fronts simultaneously. Now, before we continue into the wars themselves, we need to clear up a point of geography, because it's easy to get this wrong, and accuracy matters here. Westeros is bordered by different seas depending on where you stand. The Shivering Sea lies to the north and east. The cold water beyond the wall's eastern reaches and along the northern coast of Essos. The Narrow Sea, by contrast, is the strip of water separating Westeros from Essos further south. The same sea that Aegon the Conqueror would later cross with his dragons, and the same Sea Andal ships crossed to reach the Vale of Arryn generations before Theon was born. According to the histories, when Theon Stark carried the war back to Andalos, he sailed across the Narrow Sea, not the Shivering Sea. It's a small distinction, but it matters, because the two seas represent very different strategic realities. The Narrow Sea was the highway of the Andal migration, the route east toward Essos and the Andals' ancestral homeland. The Shivering Sea, further north, was the world of raiders, whalers, and the wildling clans along the northern coastline, a different theater of northern history entirely, when Theon's reign brushed against through his dealings with the Ironborn and the Wall, but not through his invasion of Andalos itself. Getting this right matters because it shapes how we understand the geography of Theon's wars. His campaign against the Andals was a campaign to the east and south across the Narrow Sea. His campaign against the Ironborn, by contrast, was fought along the western coastline of the north itself. No crossing of open ocean required, because the Ironborn came to him. Now we come to the core of Theon's reign, the wars that earned him his name. According to the world of Ice and Fire, Theon Stark's confirmed campaigns include the war against the invading Andals, culminating in the Battle of the Weeping Water and the retaliatory strike on Andalos itself. A conflict around the Three Sisters, islands in the bight between the north and the Vale. A landing on the Fingers, the narrow peninsulas jutting from the Vale's northern coast, which may have been the opening move of a much longer conflict called the War Across the Water. The suppression of a rebellion from a region known as the Rills, assistance given to the Night's Watch in a major, generational defeat inflicted on the wildlings beyond the Wall, and the expulsion of an Ironborn invasion led by King Harag Hor and his son Ravos, which had seized the stony shore, burned part of the Wolfswood, and used Bear Island as a forward base. That is an extraordinary number of fronts for a single reign. East against the Andals, south and east again around the Three Sisters and the Fingers, north beyond the Wall against the Wildlings, west against the Ironborn. If even half of these campaigns happened within the same reign, which the histories suggest they did, it's easy to see why later Northmen didn't remember Theon as a king who won one great battle and then rested. They remembered a king whose entire life seems to have been consumed by war on every border of his kingdom at once. This raises an important question. Was Theon simply the unlucky king who happened to rule during a moment when every neighbor of the north turned hostile at the same time? Or did his own aggression, the invasion of Andalos, the strikes on the Three Sisters and the Fingers, actually provoke some of these conflicts? The histories don't resolve this for us. What they preserve is the outcome, not the motive. Chapter 9. Why was Theon called the Hungry Wolf? Let's take a closer look at the nickname itself, because it's more layered than it first appears. According to the histories, Theon earned the name the Hungry Wolf for two overlapping reasons. The first is physical. His statue depicts him as notably thin, almost wasted-looking, with long, unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. A striking contrast to the broad-shouldered, armored image most people associate with a warrior king. The second reason is the one that matters more for this documentary: the constant state of war the North endured throughout his reign. Put those two things together, and you get an image that's almost poetic in a grim way. A king so consumed by unending warfare that it seemed to hollow him out physically, even as it made his kingdom's enemies fear him more with every campaign. Whether that's literally true, whether Theon was thin because of stress, poor health, or simply his natural build, the histories don't say. What we can say with confidence is that the North's own storytellers chose to connect his appearance directly to the wars that defined his rule. That's not an accident of language. It's how Northmen wanted this king remembered. There's also a second layer worth noting. Wolves are the sigil and the symbol of House Stark itself. Calling this particular king hungry wasn't just a comment on one man's body. It was, intentionally or not, a comment on the house he led. A wolf that never stops hunting. A kingdom that never gets to stop fighting. Chapter 10. The Sea Wolves. While the Andal Wars in the east were unfolding, an entirely separate danger was gathering on the North's western coastline: the Ironborn. According to the histories, Harag Hor, king of the Iron Islands, led a fleet of longships against the western shore of the north during Theon's reign. Harag's forces conquered the stony shore and burned portions of the Wolfswood, a direct strike at the heart of northern territory, far closer to Winterfell than any Andal invasion in the east. His son, Ravos, remembered in the histories by a brutal epithet reflecting his conduct during the campaign, used Bear Island, the home of House Mormont, as a forward base for the invasion. This is where the war turned. Theon Stark eventually killed Ravos in battle and drove the Ironborn entirely off northern shores, retaking Bear Island and a stretch of coastline referred to as Cape Kraken. What's striking here is the timing. If Theon was also fighting the Andals in the east during this same general period of his reign, and the histories place both conflicts under his kingship, then this was a king managing a genuine two-front war against two of the most dangerous seafaring powers bordering Westeros, without the benefit of a large standing navy the way the Iron Islands or later Andal-descended kingdoms would have. That the North held together at all, let alone expelled both threats, says a great deal about the military capacity Theon commanded, even if the exact numbers, tactics, and timeline of these campaigns are lost to us. Now we arrive at the most famous and most brutal chapter of Theon's reign, the invasion of Andalos itself. According to the World of Ice and Fire, the story begins defensively. An Andal warlord named Argos Sevenstar led an invasion into northern territory. Theon, allied with House Bolton, met and defeated Argos at a battle remembered as the Battle of the Weeping Water. Argos was killed in the fighting. What happened next is where Theon's reputation shifts from defender to something considerably darker. Rather than treating the victory as the end of the matter, Theon had Argos Sevenstar's body mounted on the prow of his own ship, displayed like a figurehead. and sailed his fleet across the narrow sea to the coast of Andalos, the Andals' ancestral homeland in Essos. There, according to the histories, he burned a score of Andal villages, killed hundreds of people, and captured 3 fortified tower houses along with a fortified sept. He then had the heads of his slain enemies mounted on spikes and displayed along his own coastline back home, a deliberate warning to any Andals who might consider crossing the narrow sea again. Holding that crown meant something very specific in the north, personally leading war bands across enormous distances, over difficult terrain, against enemies who might attack from the sea, from the mountains, or from beyond the wall, often with no help coming from any other kingdom in Westeros, because those other kingdoms weren't allies. They were foreign powers with their own kings. Theon Stark's ability to fight the Andals in the east and the Ironborn in the west within what appears to be a single reign is, in that light, less a curiosity and more a demonstration of exactly what the job required of a king of winter. Now we come to something that connects directly to why Theon's war against the Andals mattered so much: religion. The Starks, like most of the North, worshipped the old gods of the forest, a faith with no temples, no priesthood, and no single holy book, centered instead on sacred groves called godswoods and on ancient trees called weirwoods, believed by some to hold the memories of the first men and the children of the forest who came before them. This was the religion of the North, going back, according to Northern tradition, to the Age of Heroes itself. The Andals, by contrast, carried the faith of the Seven, a structured religion with septs, septons, and a single god with 7 aspects, and everywhere they conquered in Westeros. The faith of the Seven eventually displaced the worship of the old gods almost entirely. Everywhere, that is, except the North. This is why Theon's war against the Andals carries weight beyond simple territory. According to the broader traditions of Westeros, the North's continued worship of the old gods, still practiced generations later, in the time of Eddard Stark and his children, exists specifically because kings like Theon made sure the Andals never gained a permanent foothold north of the Neck. Every godswood still standing at Winterfell in the era of the main story is, in a very real sense, a legacy of wars fought thousands of years earlier. It's worth pausing here to ask what all of this actually cost, because the histories that survive focus almost entirely on outcomes, not on consequences. A reign filled with wars on this many fronts wasn't free. Every campaign meant men leaving farms and fishing villages to fight, sometimes for years. Every Ironborn raid on the stony shore. And the Wolfswood meant burned homes and lost harvests in a kingdom that already had painfully little surplus to spare. Every Andal counter-raid, if any occurred in response to Theon's strike on Andalos, would have fallen on northern coastal settlements least able to absorb the damage. None of this is confirmed in detail by the histories. This is reasonable interpretation, not confirmed canon, but it's worth stating plainly, because it's easy for a documentary about a warrior king to slide into celebrating the victories without acknowledging what a constant state of war, in the words the histories themselves used to describe his reign, would have actually meant for the ordinary people of the North living through it. A hungry wolf, after all, is not just a fearsome image. It's also a description of scarcity. To understand where Theon fits in Stark history, it helps to place him beside a few of the other kings of winter whose stories the histories do preserve. Theon Stark, remembered as the king who knelt, represents almost the philosophical opposite of Theon. Faced with Aegon the Conqueror's dragons, Theon chose submission over annihilation, bending the knee and preserving the North's people at the cost of its independence. Where Theon fought expansion into Andalos through fire and the display of severed heads, Theon ended nearly 3,000 years of Stark sovereignty with a single choice: not to fight at all. Brandon the Shipwright and his son Brandon the Burner offer a different kind of contrast. A story of ambition undone not by an enemy, but by the sea itself. The Shipwright built a mighty northern fleet and attempted to sail across the Sunset Sea, never to return. His grieving son burned that same fleet to nothing, leaving the north without real naval strength for centuries afterward. Theon's wars, by contrast, actually required naval capability, a fleet capable of crossing the narrow sea to reach Andalos. Whether Theon's reign happened before or after the burner, his fire is exactly the kind of chronological detail the histories don't preserve. But the contrast is instructive regardless. One king of winter used the sea to build the north's reach outward. Another destroyed that reach entirely. There's also the long, grinding war between the kings of winter and House Arryn of the Vale over the Three Sisters. A conflict Westerosi tradition says lasted roughly 1,000 years in total, well beyond any single king's reign. Theon's campaigns around the Three Sisters and the Fingers appear to be one chapter within that much longer conflict, not its beginning, and certainly not its end. Set against kings who surrendered, kings who lost fleets to grief, and a war that outlasted every king involved in it. Theon Stark stands out as the rare northern ruler remembered specifically for aggressive, sustained, multi-front military success. That's a genuinely unusual legacy in this family's long history. This is where legend begins to replace history, and it's important to be honest about that shift. We don't know precisely when Theon Stark lived. Westerosi chronology this far back is notoriously unreliable. Estimates for the coming of the Andals alone range across thousands of years, depending on which maester's account you trust, with some placing it thousands of years before Aegon's conquest, and others placing it considerably closer to the present day of the main story. Theon's reign is anchored to that same uncertain timeline. Even the order of the crypt statues that preserve his images, according to the books themselves, inconsistently described. Bran Stark passes them in one sequence, and the histories openly admit that neither ordering is confirmed to be chronological. What does this mean for a documentary trying to tell Theon's story? It means we have to be honest about the shape of the evidence. A single passage in the world of ice and fire gives us his major campaigns. A handful of book chapters give us his statue's appearance, and the fact that a much later character was named after him. Everything else, his personality, his motivations, the texture of his daily reign, is silence. That silence is exactly where legend tends to grow. It's easy to imagine fan retellings, art and stories filling in a wife, a childhood, a death scene, private words spoken before a battle. None of that is canon, and a serious account of Theon Stark has to draw a hard line between what the histories actually preserve and what popular imagination has added on top of it. And this is where Theon's reputation becomes something worth examining on its own, not as a set of events, but as a memory that outlived the man. The clearest evidence we have of how later generations of Northmen viewed Theon Stark comes from something almost incidental. Centuries after his death, House Stark named a ward, Theon Greyjoy, hostage heir to the Iron Islands, after him. Names carry weight in this world, and giving a young Ironborn hostage the name of the king, who once slaughtered Ironborn invaders and drove them off northern shores, is not a neutral choice. It reads, at minimum, as House Stark reasserting dominance through memory alone, generations after the fact. The statue itself tells a similar story. It wasn't carved to flatter. A thin, hollow-cheeked king with a scraggly beard isn't the image a house chooses if it wants to glorify a ruler's physical strength. It's the image a house chooses when the truth of the man, worn down by unending war, was considered more important or simply more memorable than flattery. Put together, the evidence suggests the North remembered Theon less as a triumphant hero and more as a grim, necessary figure, the kind of king you're relieved existed, without necessarily wanting to have lived under his rule. So why does Theon Stark still matter this many thousands of years later? Because in a very real sense, the North that Eddard Stark rules in the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire, independent-minded, still worshipping the old gods, still culturally distinct from the Andal-descended South, exists in the shape it does partly because of what Theon Stark did during his reign, He's not remembered as the founder of the North, and he's not remembered as its greatest lawgiver. He's remembered as the king who made sure the North stayed the North, when the rest of Westeros was being remade by Andal conquest all around it. That's a strange kind of legacy, earned through fire, severed heads, and a body used as a ship's figurehead. But it's the legacy the histories actually give us. Theon Stark isn't a hero in the way modern audiences usually define the word. He's something closer to a guarantee, proof that when the North's independence was directly threatened, House Stark could and would answer with overwhelming and deliberately terrifying force. We don't know how Theon's story connects, generation by generation, to the Starks who came after him. The histories don't preserve a direct line from Theon to Torrhen, or from Theon down to Eddard, Robb, or Jon Snow's adoptive family. What we can say is that he belongs to an unbroken tradition, a house that measured its kings not by how comfortably they ruled, but by how effectively they defended a kingdom that almost nothing else in Westeros wanted to leave alone. Centuries after Theon, Torrhen Stark would end that tradition of independence by kneeling to Aegon the Conqueror. Centuries after that, Eddard Stark would walk past Theon's statue without a second glance, on his way to a crypt visit that had nothing to do with ancient Andal wars. And centuries after that, Bran Stark, a boy who would eventually leave his own body behind entirely, would pause beside that same statue, reading a name that by then had become just one more king among dozens in a very long line. That's what a long shadow actually looks like in Westeros. Not a direct legacy anyone consciously invokes, just a set of choices, made in wars nobody living remembers in detail, that quietly shaped the world every later Stark inherited. So, how should we remember Theon Stark? Was he a defender? The king who held the North together against Andal invasion, Ironborn raiders, and pressure beyond the Wall, all in what looks like a single reign? The evidence supports that reading. Was he a conqueror? A king who didn't stop at defending his borders, but carried war across the narrow sea into Andalos itself, and pushed northern power outward around the Three Sisters and the Fingers? The evidence supports that reading too. Was he an expansionist king, using each defensive victory as a foundation for further reach? Quite possibly. Was he a ruthless warlord, willing to mount a dead enemy's body on his own ship and line his coastline with spiked heads to make a point? By his own recorded actions, yes, without much room for argument? The honest answer, and the only one the histories really allow, is that Theon Stark was all four of these things, depending on which campaign of his reign you're looking at. He is not a simple hero, and the surviving record makes no attempt to present him as one. He is a king remembered quite deliberately as gaunt, relentless, and terrifying, because that is exactly what the North, in that era of its history, seems to have needed to survive. The hungry wolf never stopped hunting, and whatever else is uncertain about his life, that much the North chose to remember and carve in stone for thousands of years afterward.